If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address. This is going to be a dissection of a particular video. I'm not going to be naming the individual who's responsible for it, so please don't ask. It's more about the blatantly empty and fraudulent talking points used by the incompetent class of would-be critics. Now, this person's video had a number of conceited little moves in it, not the least of which being how it began, featuring a black man whose face you've probably seen on a couple of other videos on YouTube. This is not about mentioning names. That's part of the reason why I'm going out of my way not to do that. This is about the kind of faulty logic that gets used, how individuals allow themselves to basically be pawns in a game, and what you can do to make sure that you don't fall victim to any of their falsehoods.
If you see a white family with flip-flops and short pants on riding a bicycle in your neighborhood, that is not a tourist. They live there. And don't be angry at them. In order for them to buy it, somebody's had to sell it. Why are we getting angry at white folks coming in your neighborhood? They couldn't buy it unless you sell it or don't own it in the first place. I mean, this is just real talk to me. People say, oh, we hate gentrification. No, you don't. Gentrification, the dictionary definition is a movement to middle class values. It didn't say white people. Right. Didn't say Asians. It said movement to middle class values. We can do that. Right.
Oh, so sad. Always using black people as crash dummies to hide behind, and in this guy's case, dummy describes him perfectly. See, I couldn't even make it through the video without doing it. This guy claims to have a dictionary definition of gentrification. Now, while there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, it does need to be noted that words tend to change meaning over time. He would have been better off if he had actually looked at where the term gentrification came from. The term was coined in the 1960s by a British sociologist named Ruth Glass. Now, in Britain, they're a class-based society, so you can use the term middle-class values to describe gentrification there because the dividing line in Britain is class. But in the United States, the dividing line isn't class, it's race. Ask all of those auto workers in Detroit if class distinctions are real or racial distinctions. So he misapplies the definition of the word because he's trying to de-racialize the subject that he's talking about. You remember how I told you that a deceptive rhetorical trick used by con men is the false comparison? How do you make a false comparison? You take two totally unrelated things and mention them in close proximity to each other, like say Iraq and WMDs, or Saddam and Al-Qaeda. This guy's doing the same thing with class-based and black people. White supremacy is global, so there's not a place on this planet where any black person's problems are the result of class. And since he's clearly wrong on everything he said, why is he even saying it? Because his audience that he wants is a white audience. That's who pays him. That's who he wants money from. And speaking of money, I don't know this guy's financial condition, but for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and say that he's a millionaire. Hell, even a billionaire. That doesn't mean he's smart. High net worth is not equivalent to a high IQ. If it was, then Elon Musk would be one of, if not the smartest person in the world, right? And what about people like, say, Abigail Disney of the Disney family? She's independently wealthy, worth millions and millions of dollars. And she's never been to school nor worked a day in her life. She lives off the trust fund set up by Walt Disney for his heirs. But she's worth millions of dollars. So she must be smart, right? Some people are too ignorant to realize how wealth actually works in the real world, and that's how chumps like this can sit in front of people, spout complete stupidity, and not get laughed out of the room. This guy actually then goes on to falsely claim that black people can do the same thing as white people in America do.
It didn't say white people. Right. Didn't say Asians. It said movement to middle class values. We can do that. Right.
Actually, we can't. White people in America have an entire commercial and governmental infrastructure that pays for, pushes, and promotes their real estate ventures. Banks give them money simply because. No credit check necessary, and the local and state governments help their applications sail right through the approval process. Black people, on the other hand, get redlined. And not just in one or two places, but nationwide, from Florida to California. Apparently, this genius here doesn't know that. We can add that to the mountain of things he doesn't know. Zoning boards simply as a matter of course refuse to give permits to black businesses, and just on the off chance that you're one of the rare few who manages to get through their minefield of bureaucratic obstacles, they'll turn right around and claim that some sort of code violation has occurred at your business, or that your property is suddenly out of compliance. He never mentions that. This is the day-to-day reality of black people in America. This is why, no, we can't do what white people do. We try it all the time and it fails because we're not allowed to. And for him not to mention these plain, simple, basic facts makes him a liar by omission. But then again, he's not trying to appeal to a black audience. Now, I could do more on this guy, but I think the point is made. His gibberish only makes sense if black people have equal access to capital as whites, are treated the same during the acquisition of land and permits to build as whites, if our property is appraised at the same value as whites, and none of this is true. Another thing that's not true is you have never seen black people going to white neighborhoods, buying up homes where they live, turning them into rentals. You never see black people gentrifying white people out of their own neighborhoods. No white person has ever had their rent or their property taxes suddenly shoot up because a black person bought up a whole bunch of properties in the area. But every black person has had some horror story like that. So everything he said is false. His asinine talking points only make sense if you already believe it. That is, if you ignore the language and the history and the reality. And this is why you don't want to get your information from some rando that you saw in an Instagram video. Now, let's go ahead and deal with the individual who actually posted a video. Again, I'm going to be addressing this in a way that's deliberately oblique. I'm not trying to bring any sort of attention to this clown.
So I heard this and I had to share a story. So this is 2008. So my wife and I and a business partner, we purchased a couple of properties in downtown Phoenix in the Fillmore district. So there was 3 properties. One was just an empty lot and then 2 houses. So we took those houses and we took them back to the original build. I mean, everything down to the inside, baseboards, window, lap siding, the whole 9. Everything was taken back to the original, and these houses were absolutely beautiful. And then when we stayed there, we got to know this guy, Richard. He knew everybody's business. I remember him coming down one day, and he said, "Hey, I just want to let you know that a lot of the folks here aren't happy with you living here." And I like, "Why? Like, what'd I do?" And he goes, "They have a problem with the white people moving in." Took me back for a second. I thought, well, I said, "Well, Richard, if it helps, tell him that I'm Mexican. And my wife is white, but I'm Mexican. Is that, if that helps?" And I'm kind of making a joke of it. He goes, "Yeah, I don't have a problem." He goes, "I don't have a problem with it, but yeah, a lot of people have a problem with you guys living here." And I was so taken back by that just because I thought we didn't do anything but make the neighborhood better. The houses, by the way, were crack houses. When we took them over, there was holes in the floor, squatters, people weren't even paying rent. They weren't even habitable. They would just go there, smoke their crack. There was one guy who ended up having some drug overdose and the fire department had to drag him out. So the houses were not good for the neighborhood. We come in, we take these things back to the original condition. It's a beautiful neighborhood, and we're getting for it. That kind of struck a chord where I just don't understand the idea that taking a neighborhood and making it better or being a different color and making a neighborhood better is somehow bad for the neighborhood. Long story short, I know that they had it out for us because whenever we weren't there, the house got broken into 5, 6 different times.
Did you, get that? He said that the neighbors had it in for him. I knew they had it in for us.
They'd bust down the front door. We'd secure the front door. They'd bust in the side door. We secure that. We basically had that thing locked down so you couldn't even come through the doors. We had one of the neighbors tell us because they broke in. They sent a 7-year-old through one of the windows to go unlock the door from the inside. So when I heard that, I was like, you know what? It's not worth it because every time they'd bust in, it was obviously thousands of dollars worth of damage. They'd always rip the TVs off the walls. So they made it known that we weren't welcome there. So we ended up selling the properties. And I just went back probably about a year ago. And if you look at that neighborhood now, it's pretty much, those houses do stand out now. There's you can tell that they were remodeled at least within the past decade or so. But the neighborhood itself is run down. People sleeping on the sidewalks, people doing their drugs, trash everywhere. The lawns that we had all manicured, everything's trash, just trash. And so my question to you is if you're a person, black or Mexican, and you hate a white person for making your neighborhood better, if you perceive that as a bad thing, I'd like to know why. Why is that a bad thing when someone comes in and makes the neighborhood better? And I see on there, people are going to think the rent's going up. Okay, so what's worse, rent going up or drug dealing is going on in your neighborhood? That's a choice you have. You can have a nicer neighborhood and safe, or you can keep the rent low, which makes sense, right? And you can have people shooting up and prostituting in front of your house. I don't get it. So I'd like for someone to just chime in on this and let me know what you think. But I faced this firsthand. It's disheartening because we thought we were doing a good thing, but yeah, that's not how they saw it.
This individual, he began his video like this, and not even 1 minute in, we already have a bunch of falsehoods and fallacies. Now, this guy says that they were living there. At least that's what he claims. He claimed they were living there. Yeah, they bought 3 properties, 2 of them houses. I guess they were living in both of the houses or something. Him and his family living in 2 different houses and an empty lot. This just sounds suspect as all get out. But for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and say that we're in crazy land where this kind of insanity actually makes sense. But then he also said whenever they weren't there. So they live there, but they're not there. So this guy's claiming that they were living there. Well, I question that, because what he's saying doesn't seem to have much consistency to it. But for the sake of argument, you can believe it if you want. But as far as I'm concerned, we'll put living there in quotations. And did you catch earlier where he mentioned a business partner?
So my wife and I and a business partner, we purchased a couple of properties in downtown Phoenix in the Fillmore district.
Now, if this guy was simply trying to live in that neighborhood, quote unquote live there, what's the business partner for? Shouldn't there just be a bank, somebody to handle the mortgage or what have you? The place is being broken into constantly. They bolted the place up so that you can't even get in through the doors. That's what he said. So how is it that they're living there? So the more you listen, the less it sounds like this guy was living there as much as it was that this guy was being a landlord there. He claims that they didn't like him because he was a white Latino. Nobody actually said to him that that was a problem, but he spends his entire video trying desperately to play the victim when, by his own admission, nobody said anything racist to him or did anything to him. Yet he goes on this insane rant about imaginary black people discriminating against him because he claims some anonymous person on the street told him they had. His entire video is about race, and yet the title of his video is about class. Sounds like somebody's guilty conscience is showing. This guy references his location as being in Phoenix, Arizona. Chris Rock, in one of the few intelligent things he's ever said, joked that there's more polar bears in Arizona than there are black people, and it's true. Phoenix demographics are majority Hispanic. The area he was talking about, the Fillmore area, is also the same. He himself said it. He's Mexican. His wife is white Latino most likely. Okay, so since he's in a majority Hispanic city, why did he have a black man at the start of his video? And why did he make it a point to mention black people before he mentioned Mexicans? By the way, he didn't say Latino, he said Mexican, so what does that tell you? First of all, aren't white conservatives like him always whining about people playing the race card and always bringing up race and attributing everything to race? This guy reaches deep into his own demented imagination to invent a phony white victim narrative, though. He buys some houses so he can fix them up just enough to get to code so he can then rent them out. This guy doesn't want to become a neighbor in that neighborhood. He wants to just be a landlord, and he sees the lower property values in the area as making them easy takings. So let's get that straight. This guy wasn't buying houses so that he could actually live in that area. How can he be a neighbor if he doesn't live there? He's no different than BlackRock or any other sort of real estate concern that buys up a whole bunch of houses and then says, here's what the rents are going to be. And he claims something about neighborhood. This guy complains because the people don't see him as a neighbor. That's because he's not a neighbor. But he is right when he claims that these are middle-class values. And his neighbors were right to mistrust him. He wears his bias and prejudice as a badge of honor. He also made an oblique mention of gentrification. But like the rest of his talking points, that's hollow and false too. He's completely dismissive of the economic plight of the people in that neighborhood because he doesn't care. When there's gentrification, the rents tend to go up for renters, and the property values go up for homeowners, which means higher property taxes. He chose to go to a poor neighborhood where the people can barely afford rent or the property tax, and here he is parachuting in out of nowhere doing things that he himself admits are going to raise the rents and the property taxes for the poorest people in the city. Or, as he blithely puts it, what's worse, the rent going up or drug dealing going on in your neighborhood?
I see on there, people are going to think the rent's going up. Okay, so what's worse, rent going up or drug dealing is going on in your neighborhood? That's a choice you have.
First of all, what he's doing won't result merely in higher rents. It's going to result in people being evicted because they can't afford the rent where it stands now. How can they afford it if it goes up? What he's doing is going to cause evictions, not merely people having to pay more for rent. And what's his reaction to that? You saw it. He doesn't even pretend to care about that. Instead, he just blissfully ignores that economic reality and instead acts as if everybody can easily afford for the rent to go up. Because if he acknowledged that they can't, then it would shoot down his phony white victimhood narrative. Again, he never bothered to see if any of his assumptions were actually true. He never took any sort of interest in the people there, or wondered why they couldn't stand him. And yet he went out of his way to try to make it seem as if, well, they just didn't like me because of race. He gave the people there tons of legitimate reasons to dislike him that had nothing to do with race. But like all conservatives, he needs to justify his own prejudices, so he projects them onto everyone else. And secondly, and most importantly, he presented yet another logical fallacy when he said, "That's the choice you have." See, one of the worst logical fallacies is the presentation of a false choice, as if you have to choose between whatever the speaker says are the options, when in reality, higher rents or drug dealers is not the only option you have. This guy talks as if you can't solve the drug problem without pricing the people out of their homes. He never even attempts to discuss that because he doesn't care. Even if you're simple-minded enough to agree with him, you have to admit that all he's doing is merely moving the drug addicts and drug dealers around the city. He's not solving anything, he's just moving them on to another neighborhood. They'll simply go to another part of town and resume their behavior. You can't escape the fact that the cycle of poverty has to be broken first. But he doesn't even mention that at all, now does he? So contrary to how he tried to pretend that he didn't know why people resented his presence, he showed he knows exactly why the locals didn't want him there. And he also knows that it's not about race, too. The U.S. made it where money is attached to race, and he has no problem with that because it benefits him. But when someone merely tells him what the problem is, he's such a delicate little snowflake he can't handle it. This guy never actually encountered any sort of racism directly or indirectly from anyone. By his own admission, the only evidence that he claimed to have was that one guy allegedly said that some folks had some misgivings about him being there. Not about his race, but about him and what he was doing. Seems to me that whomever this alleged person was, and we only have his word for that, and I make no promises as to what that's worth. Sounds like this one alleged informant that he claims told him this, that's the guy he should have been looking at. He doesn't even bother to try to see if any of this is true or not. He makes no attempt to meet the people in the area to talk to them or find out what their concerns are or what he could do differently or better. Nobody calls him any racial slurs, nobody throws anything at him or threatens him, nobody calls the police on the white Latino guy in the area, so where's the racism at? This is how desperate these anti-black bigots are to make a false equivalence between the real racism that they practice against black people and their own guilty conscience when they're in a black neighborhood and the people don't immediately bow down and worship them. But these are the lengths he had to go to in order to invent a white victim narrative. Now, individuals like this love to say that racism is not a problem. Until something like this happens, then all of a sudden, race is a really big issue. It's holding neighborhoods back. The redlining by the banks and the government, and also having all of these little racist bureaucrats who are doing all this stuff against black people, the racist realtors and such, that's not holding these neighborhoods back at all. The people who are looking at this guy who parachuted in out of nowhere and doing all this mess that they know is going to make their lives harder, that's the real problem. When something happens that he doesn't like, now racism is a problem. It's just tearing America apart. It's causing all these problems. Wah, wah, wah. But part of the reason that I decided to say a few words about this guy's video is because right off the bat, he started dropping the racial code words, saying things like crack houses.
The houses, by the way, were crack houses.
Now, out there in Arizona, meth is far more prevalent than crack ever was. And he also goes on to make sure he mentions black people in a city that is majority Hispanic. And in the video, he made sure that when he was talking about how the neighborhood's going down, he made certain to have black people on the screen. So based on what he himself chose to tell us and show us, we can reasonably assume this guy could care less about drugs and is far more concerned with skin color. And he clearly seems to have a chip on his shoulder about black people. Now, he didn't say that the neighbors who he claims had a problem with him were black. And yet he has black people all throughout his video, from the beginning to the end. He mentions black people literally from start to finish. Well, if he didn't want people to draw a false conclusion about who he was talking about, he shouldn't have made it a point to keep mentioning black people and featuring black people unnecessarily in his video.
Is if you're a person, black or Mexican, and you hate a white person for making your neighborhood better,
and using what I would say is racially coded language like crack houses, etc. So I will infer from this that his frequently showing and mentioning black people in his video is because that's who he's talking about, since he never specified that it wasn't. These big bad black neighbors didn't burn down his house. They didn't attack him or his children. They didn't constantly call the police because this white Latino was walking the street in their neighborhood. And that is not prejudice on their part, it's pattern recognition. This guy wasn't doing anything to help them. He wasn't moving into the neighborhood to live there. He was just trying to find out how he could get money out of the place. So why is he so worried about what the locals think of him when he wasn't even going to be living there? It's all about his investment and whether or not this was going to be a problem for him to get the money out of that neighborhood that he wanted to get out of it. No matter what he tries to claim, this wasn't a case of some non-black person wanting to peacefully coexist with black people. This was just the same old gentrification. He never mentions that. He doesn't mention that word at all, because if he did, then he'd have to admit, oh, so that's why people were giving me the side eye. These are the poorest people in town. They can barely afford the property taxes or the rent, and now what I'm doing is going to jack up both. But I'm not doing anything to help build the group economics of that area. I'm just another parasite buying distressed homes at low prices and then doing the bare minimum to get them barely up to code and then selling through for a profit. That's what this guy actually is. So that's why the word gentrification never came up throughout his entire asinine rant. And you know another thing that he conveniently decided not to mention? His neighbors' names, or anything about his alleged new neighbors. He didn't mention them because he never met them. He made no effort to. He kept his distance from them. So this stranger comes into their neighborhood. He's not there to become a neighbor. He's there simply to be a landlord. And the landlords are unscrupulous to say the least. And he keeps making all of these backhanded remarks when it comes to black people. Is it any wonder why they don't like him? They could probably smell the bias and prejudice on him from a mile away. And by the way, his claiming that he's not white isn't the reason that they don't like him. His skin color is incidental. That's not prejudice on their part. That's called pattern recognition because they've been living it their entire lives. And no matter what he tried to claim, let's cut the crap here. He didn't buy those homes to help that neighborhood. He bought them to help himself. Habitat for Humanity builds homes to help people. This guy is just your run-of-the-mill house flipper who somebody really needs to check to make sure that those houses he's flipping are up to code. If he was as honest about those houses as he was his black neighbors, I'd be really worried. You know who this guy reminds me of? The Toohey family. You remember them, don't you? The white suburban middle-class family who adopted the black football player Michael Oher? I hear they made some mediocre movie about it. Well, with all their propaganda, they claim they did it simply because they wanted nothing more to help this poor, downtrodden young black man and all the rest of it. His mother was on crack. All of his neighbors were a bunch of losers. Someone's got to help these Negroes out, right? They were just some white suburbanites who were being criticized for their selfless efforts to lift up the poor, downtrodden black crack addicts. Well, as it turned out, they were as racist as everyone was saying they were, and Michael Oher is suing them for ripping him off. So they turned out to be exactly what everybody said. These are your middle-class values, as the poster of this video claimed. Again, I don't know who this guy is and don't care. And looking at his view count, nobody else cares either. I don't even know why YouTube put this crap into my feed, and now that I know who he is, I'll forget about him before the end of this video. I'm sure you will too, but understand, this guy is the same kind of person who claims there's no racism. At least he'll be the first one to claim that until something happens that he doesn't like. And if you choose to believe that, you're pretty gullible. Taking advantage wherever they can, being handed all kinds of benefits and advantages just because, then turning around and complaining that you work so hard when things have been handed to you, yeah, that's those middle-class values, all right. And at the end of his rant, he pathetically tries to play the victim when in reality, he was the villain. He feebly tries to claim, I was just trying to do a good thing. This man showed nothing but open contempt for the people who live in that neighborhood. He disparaged them. He made no attempt to meet them or talk to them or find out how he could be a good neighbor. Yet, like all these conceited people, he tries to bestow honor on himself by claiming he was just trying to do a good thing. As Dr. King said, nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. This guy is a prime example of both, though clearly he's far more guilty of the latter. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Codified Trucking, Suleiman Alaji, Jacques Harget, Kareem Lawless, and Frederica Moore. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.